I said license and registration now. Are you deaf?
With all due respect, officer, you haven't told me why you pulled me over.
Your driving is the reason. Now get your hands where I can see them.
The midday sun pressed down on the city, turning asphalt soft and casting sharp, unforgiving shadows. It was a Tuesday, a day of mundane rhythm, delivery trucks rumbling, office workers moving in predictable streams, the steady hum of a metropolis at work. For Officer Kevin Thorne, aged 36 and a 9-year veteran of the force, this rhythm was a doctrine. His world was one of patterns, of things that belonged and things that did not. He saw his beat not as a community to protect, but as a grid to be kept in order, and his own judgment was the ultimate arbiter of that order. His record was clean, marked by aggressive enforcement and a high number of citations, a fact his superiors noted with a mixture of approval and private caution. To his colleagues, he was efficient. To himself, he was a bulwark against the slow creep of disorder. And then he saw it. A Lincoln Navigator gleaming obsidian black, its chrome grille catching the sun like a predator's smile. It was a vessel of quiet wealth and power, parked flawlessly parallel to the curb on a street lined with modest sedans and well-worn minivans. It wasn't illegally parked. It wasn't blocking a fire hydrant or occupying a permit-only space. It was simply present. And for Thorne, its presence was a disruption, a discordant note in the day's simple melody. The vehicle itself was an anomaly, but the true source of the officer's immediate tightening suspicion was the man who stood beside it. He was a black man, perhaps in his early 40s, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, no tie. He leaned against the passenger door, not with the anxiety of someone waiting for a tow, but with the patient posture of a man who owned the space he occupied. He was checking his phone, his expression neutral, his presence calm. This calmness, more than the expensive vehicle, is what ignited the flint of Thorne's prejudice. In his rigid worldview, this combination, the man, the car, the location, did not compute. It was an equation that could only be solved by assuming a variable was out of place. And Thorne had already decided which variable it was. He didn't see a successful professional. He didn't see a government official on assignment or a lawyer meeting a client. He saw a threat disguised in expensive fabric. He saw a story he had already written in his mind, one of illicit gains and false fronts. His hand instinctively went to his duty belt, a familiar comfort. He squared his shoulders, the fabric of his uniform straining slightly. He wasn't responding to a call. He was initiating a confrontation based on a feeling, a gut instinct he had long ago mistaken for legitimate police work. The pedestrians flowing around the scene were just scenery. The actual laws of traffic and parking were merely a pretext. The real issue for Officer Thorne was an image that challenged his authority by simply existing. He started his approach, each step firm, deliberate, carrying the full weight of the badge on his chest and the bias simmering beneath it. The man by the car looked up from his phone, his calm gaze meeting the officer's advancing stare. The silence between them was charged, a vacuum waiting for the first word to break the seal. Thorne already knew what his first words would be. They wouldn't be a question, they would be an assertion of control. Officer Thorne stopped a few feet from the man, creating an immediate, deliberate zone of authority. He didn't greet him. He didn't ask how his day was going. He surveyed the man, Marcus Vance, from his polished shoes to his neatly trimmed hair, his gaze lingering just long enough to be insulting. Then he looked at the navigator, his expression a carefully practiced mask of professional skepticism that barely concealed a deeper contempt. "This is a nice car for this part of town," Thorne began, his voice flat, devoid of warmth. It was a statement, not a compliment, an opening gambit designed to put the other man on the defensive. He let the words hang in the air, a baited hook. Marcus Vance slid his phone into his jacket pocket, his movements economical and smooth. He didn't rise to the bait. He didn't bristle at the implication. He met the officer's gaze directly, his own expression unreadable. It gets me where I need to go, he replied, his voice a calm, even baritone. The simple, non-confrontational answer seemed to irritate Thorne. He had expected a flicker of nervousness, a defensive retort, something to justify the narrative building in his head. The man's composure was a form of resistance he couldn't easily categorize. He took another half-step forward, subtly invading Vance's personal space. "License and registration," Thorne demanded. Not a request, a command. Vance didn't move immediately. "Am I being detained, officer? Have I violated a law?" he asked. The question was polite, rooted in a clear understanding of his rights, but Thorne heard it as insolence. "I'm conducting a stop," Thorne snapped, his patience already wearing thin. "You're parked in a suspicious manner." A faint, almost imperceptible line appeared on Vance's brow. "Suspicious? Officer, I'm parallel to the curb, within the marked lines, and more than 15 feet from the crosswalk. Which statute am I violating?" The precision of the response was another irritant. This man knew the rules, and instead of being intimidated, he was using them as a shield. Thorne felt a surge of frustration. This wasn't going according to his script. He was supposed to be in control, asking the questions, setting the pace. "Your vehicle doesn't fit the neighborhood," Thorne stated, finally giving voice to the prejudice that fueled his actions. "It's probable cause for me to believe it may be stolen." Vance's expression remained placid, but a new stillness settled over him, the kind of stillness that precedes a critical decision. "Officer," he said, his tone still level, "are you asserting that the make of my vehicle in this specific geographic location constitutes probable cause for a criminal investigation?" The question was a trap, and Thorne knew it. It was the kind of question a lawyer would ask, one designed to be replayed in a courtroom or a disciplinary hearing. A smarter officer would have paused, recalibrated, perhaps even checked the license plate before proceeding. But Thorne wasn't feeling smart. He was feeling challenged. His authority had been questioned, and his ego demanded satisfaction. "I'm the one asking the questions here," he growled. "Now, I'm not going to ask you again. License and registration." He gestured impatiently toward the vehicle. "And step away from the car. It's being impounded." The word impounded changed the atmosphere instantly. It was a gross overreach, a punitive measure for a non-existent crime. It was a pure power play, and both men knew it. Vance looked from the officer to the empty street behind him, a flicker of something, disappointment perhaps, crossing his face for the first time. He had offered the officer a chance to de-escalate, to follow procedure. The offer had been rejected. Marcus Vance remained perfectly still, his posture unchanged. He watched Officer Thorne, not with fear or anger, but with a kind of clinical observation. He was processing the officer's words, his tone, his body language, filing them away as data points. The threat to impound the vehicle was not a procedural step. It was a declaration of intent. Thorne was no longer enforcing the law. He was imposing his will. "On what grounds are you impounding my vehicle, officer?" Vance asked. His voice had lost none of its steadiness. It was this unwavering composure that acted like gasoline on the embers of Thorne's impatience. A compliant citizen would be nervous. A guilty man would be angry or defensive. This man was simply watching. Suspicious vehicle, possible involvement in criminal activity, and a non-compliant driver, Thorne rattled off, the justification sounding hollow even to his own ears. He hadn't seen a crime. He hadn't witnessed a violation. His entire case was built on the foundation of a feeling. "I have not been non-compliant," Vance corrected him gently. "I have asked for clarification, which is my right. You have refused to provide it." Thorne scoffed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Your rights don't include telling me how to do my job. You look like you don't belong here, and this car looks stolen. That's enough for me." He pulled his radio from its holster, the action sharp and aggressive. He was done talking. He was moving to action. "Dispatch, this is Unit 714, he said, his voice taking on a formal, clipped tone for the recording. "I need a tow truck at my location, corner of Elm and 4th. I have a vehicle, a black Lincoln Navigator, plate number..." He paused, glancing at the plate for the first time. 6-X-Ray-Juliet-2-1. It's being impounded pending investigation. Vance listened to the transmission without interruption. He noted the officer's careful phrasing, the way he was already building a record to protect himself, a record that omitted his own provocations and Vance's calm, reasonable questions. He watched as Thorne put the radio back, a smug look of finality on his face. The call had been made. The gears of the system, once engaged, were hard to stop. For Thorne, this was checkmate. "The tow will be here in 15 minutes, Thorne said, crossing his arms. "You can either wait on the sidewalk, or you can wait in the back of my car. Your choice." The threat was clear. Any further resistance would be met with arrest. Vance gave a slow, deliberate nod.
"I'll wait right here, officer,"
he said, his gaze fixed on Thorne. He did not move to the sidewalk. He did not move toward the car. He simply stood his ground, a calm island in the storm the officer was so desperate to create. His stillness was a silent act of defiance, more powerful than any shouted curse. He was forcing the officer to make the next move, to physically escalate the situation if he wanted to enforce his arbitrary command. Thorne's jaw tightened. The man's refusal to be intimidated was infuriating. He wanted a reaction. He wanted fear. What he got was patience, and it felt like mockery. The distant whine of a heavy-duty engine could be heard approaching, a sound that signaled the impending arrival of the next phase of Thorne's manufactured crisis. He felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The spectacle was about to begin. The tow truck turned the corner, its yellow emergency lights flashing in silent, rhythmic pulses that painted the street in brief strokes of amber. It was a large, formidable vehicle, and its arrival was a piece of street theater that immediately drew an audience. A woman walking her dog slowed her pace, her curiosity piqued. A pair of construction workers on their lunch break leaned against a nearby wall, their conversation forgotten. A man on his apartment balcony above paused, his phone held loosely in his hand. Officer Thorne felt the weight of their gazes and welcomed it. In his mind, the tow truck was his backup, a mechanical extension of his authority. Its physical presence validated his decision, transforming a baseless confrontation into what appeared to be a legitimate law enforcement action. His posture straightened, and a smirk played at the corners of his mouth. He was in control, and now everyone could see it. The tow operator, a burly man named Sal with grease-stained hands and a weary expression, maneuvered the truck into position. He hopped down from the cab, his eyes taking in the scene. The gleaming navigator, the calm black man in the suit, and the officer standing with his chest puffed out like a bantam rooster. Sal had seen this tableau 100 times before. It rarely ended quietly. "What we got?" Sal asked, his voice a gravelly rumble. He glanced at the navigator, then back at Thorne, waiting for instructions. "Impound," Thorne said, gesturing dismissively toward the luxury SUV. "Owner's being uncooperative. Let's get it hooked up and out of here." The word uncooperative hung in the air. Marcus Vance hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. His hands remained loosely at his sides. He watched as Sal unspooled a heavy chain, the metal links clanking against the pavement. The sound was loud, definitive. Each clank was a step closer to a line being crossed, a mistake being made permanent. Vance directed his gaze to the tow operator. "Sir," he said, his voice calm but carrying enough to be heard clearly over the truck's idling engine. "I would advise you to wait." Sal paused, the chain halfway to the ground. He looked from Vance to Thorne, caught in the middle. He was contracted by the police. His job was to follow the officer's orders. But the man in the suit had a confidence that gave him pause. He looked like someone who knew things Sal didn't. Thorne stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "You don't talk to him," he barked at Vance. "You talk to me, and I told you to step away from the car." He then turned to Sal. "Hook it up. Now." Sal hesitated for another fraction of a second, a silent appeal to the officer. Thorne's glare was all the answer he needed. With a resigned shrug, he knelt and began to position the hooks under the navigator's front axle. The sight of the metal chains nearing the polished chrome of his vehicle finally prompted a physical response from Vance. He took a single, deliberate step forward, placing himself between the tow operator and the front bumper. He didn't say a word. He simply stood there. It was a passive, non-violent act of obstruction, yet it was as effective as a barricade. Sal froze, his hands hovering over the axle. He looked up at Vance, then shot a nervous glance at Thorne. "Officer, he's in the way!" The crowd of onlookers had grown. The man on the balcony was now openly recording with his phone. The spectacle Thorne had wanted was unfolding, but the narrative was slipping from his grasp. He was no longer the confident enforcer of order. He was an angry man being stonewalled by a calm one. "Sir," Thorne said, his voice dangerously low, "I am giving you one final warning. Move, or you will be placed under arrest." Marcus Vance didn't look at Officer Thorne. His gaze remained on the tow operator, Sal, who was still crouched awkwardly by the front of the Navigator. The public theater of the situation was now at its peak. The flashing lights, the growing crowd of silent onlookers, the palpable tension between the two men at its center. Vance understood that every word, every action was being recorded, not just by the officer's body camera, but by the informal jury of citizens on the sidewalk. "Officer," Vance said, his voice still measured, his tone deliberately devoid of challenge. "Before your associate attaches that equipment to this vehicle, I am formally requesting that you perform a simple procedural step." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "I don't take requests from you." "This isn't about you or me," Vance replied, turning his head slightly to meet the officer's glare. "This is about procedure. It's about preventing a mistake. All I am asking is that you run the license plate through your dispatch and wait for full verification of the vehicle's registration." It was a perfectly reasonable request. In fact, it was what Thorne should have done before ever initiating the stop. It was standard operating procedure, a foundational element of police work designed to separate assumption from fact. The request laid bare the officer's procedural shortcut for all to see. He hadn't acted on evidence, he had acted on a biased impulse, and now he was being publicly called to account for it, albeit politely. For Thorne, the request felt like a calculated insult, a public questioning of his competence. He felt the eyes of the bystanders on him, felt their judgment. To back down now, to follow the request of the man he had already condemned, would be a humiliating loss of face. His pride, fragile and overinflated, would not allow it. "I don't need to run the plate," Thorne lied, his voice rising in volume. "I already know everything I need to know. This vehicle is being towed." "You are refusing to verify the registration?" Vance asked, his question simple and direct. He wasn't arguing. He was establishing a fact for the record. "Did you, Officer Thorne, refuse to perform a basic procedural check?" The question hung in the air, sharp and clear. Even Sal, the tow operator, seemed to recognize the significance of the moment. He slowly stood up, backing away from the vehicle. This was escalating beyond a routine impound. "I'm not refusing anything," Thorne snarled, trying to regain control of the narrative. "I'm giving you a lawful order to move. You are obstructing a police investigation." "There is no investigation," Vance stated calmly. "There is only an action you have initiated without proper verification. An action that is about to cause significant damage to federal government property." He let the last few words land with quiet, deliberate weight. He had not raised his voice. He had not made a threat. He had simply presented a new piece of information, a fact that was in direct opposition to the entire foundation of Officer Thorne's reality. The mention of federal government property was a key turning a lock, but Thorne was too enraged to hear it properly. He heard it only as another lie, another desperate tactic from a man he had already judged to be a criminal. "You think making up a story is going to help you?" Thorne laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Federal property, right, that's a new one." He turned to Sal, his face a mask of fury. "I'm ordering you to hook up that vehicle. Do it now, or your city contract is going to have a full review." The threat was effective. Sal looked at Vance, then at the enraged officer, and made his choice. He knelt again, reaching for the chains. The clinking of the tow chains was the only sound for a moment, a metallic heartbeat counting down to an irreversible action. Marcus Vance watched Sal's hands, saw the reluctance in his movements, but knew the man was now acting under duress. The threat to his contract was a powerful motivator. Vance's focus shifted back to the true source of the conflict. Officer Thorne stood with his feet planted wide, a posture of aggressive certainty. His hand had drifted down and was now resting on the cold steel of his handcuffs. It wasn't a casual gesture. It was a deliberate signal, the next step in his pre-written script of escalation. If the tow truck didn't intimidate the subject, the threat of arrest would. "I'm going to say this one last time," Thorne said, his voice dropping into a low, menacing register that he believed was intimidating. "Step back, or these cuffs go on." The threat was no longer veiled. It was raw and public. The woman with the dog had stopped completely, her hand covering her mouth. The man on the balcony held his phone with both hands, ensuring a steady shot. They were no longer just watching a confrontation. They were witnessing a potential arrest, a man's freedom being threatened over a parking spot. Vance did not step back. He held his ground, his body a silent shield for the vehicle behind him. But he did turn his full attention to Thorne, his calm gaze locking with the officer's heated one. "Officer," Vance said, his tone still remarkably even, "let's be very clear about what is happening. You are threatening to detain me. For what specific crime? Obstruction of governmental administration?" Thorne smirked. "That's the one." "And the governmental administration I am supposedly obstructing," Vance continued, "is the towing of this vehicle, an action you initiated without verifying its legal status despite my repeated requests. Is that an accurate summary of the situation?" He was narrating the events, laying out the chain of causality with the precision of a prosecutor. He was creating a verbal record, a clear, unambiguous account that would stand in stark contrast to the officer's emotional, impulsive actions. Each carefully chosen word was a brick in the wall of Thorne's impending professional ruin. The officer felt a flicker of uncertainty. The man's language was too precise, too legal, but he was in too deep to retreat now. The crowd, the tow truck, his own ego, they all held him hostage. He had to see it through. "All I hear is a lot of talking from a guy who's about to go to jail," Thorne shot back, his hand now unsnapping the strap on his handcuff pouch. The click was audible in the tense silence. "Your little lawyer games aren't going to work on me." "This isn't a game," Vance replied, and for the first time a note of something hard like granite entered his voice. "This is a final opportunity for you to reconsider your course of action. You are about to make a mistake with severe consequences." The warning was explicit. It was not a plea. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered by a man who seemed absolutely certain of the outcome. Sal, the tow operator, heard it and paused again, the heavy hook just inches from the navigator's frame. He looked at the man in the suit, at his unyielding posture and the profound confidence in his eyes, and a seed of genuine doubt began to sprout in his mind. He was just the tow guy. This felt like something far more serious. He slowly lowered the hook to the pavement. Thorne saw the hesitation. He saw his authority being undermined by the subject's sheer force of will. The last vestige of his professional restraint snapped. "That's it," he snarled, taking a decisive step forward. "You're under arrest." He reached for Vance's arm. As Officer Thorne's hand shot out to grab his arm, Marcus Vance moved with a speed and economy that was startling. He didn't retreat. He didn't resist. He simply shifted his weight and took a half step to the side, causing Thorne's grasping fingers to close on empty air. The move was fluid, precise, and utterly non-aggressive. It was the movement of a man with extensive training in situational awareness and de-escalation. A man who knew how to control a space without throwing a punch. Thorne stumbled slightly, his momentum carrying him forward. The clumsy lunge, meant to be an assertion of physical dominance, ended in an awkward misstep that further eroded his crumbling authority. He spun around, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. "Don't you resist me!" he yelled, his voice cracking with emotion. "I am not resisting, officer," Vance said, his hands now held up, open and empty, in a universal gesture of non-aggression. "I am avoiding unlawful contact. You do not have legal cause to place me under arrest, therefore you do not have the right to touch me." The legal precision of his words, spoken with such unshakable calm, seemed to short-circuit Thorne's brain. He stood there for a second, breathing heavily, caught between the impulse to charge again and the dawning, terrifying realization that he was completely out of his depth. The man wasn't acting like any civilian he had ever encountered. He wasn't scared, he wasn't loud, he wasn't pleading. He was teaching. He was delivering a field lecture on constitutional law while Thorne was trying to start a brawl. The crowd on the sidewalk murmured. The scene had shifted again. It was no longer a simple case of a stubborn citizen and an impatient cop. The power dynamic had been subtly but completely inverted. Vance, with his open hands and steady voice, appeared to be the one in control. Thorne, with his flushed face and misplaced aggression, looked increasingly unhinged. The tow operator, Sal, had now backed away completely and was leaning against the grill of his truck, arms crossed. He had made a decision. He would not touch the navigator again until this was resolved by someone with a higher rank than the frantic officer in front of him. He was officially a spectator. Thorne felt utterly exposed. His bluff had been called. His threat of physical force had been deflected without effort. He was standing in the middle of the street, his authority in tatters, with a growing audience watching his professional meltdown. He had only one card left to play, the one he had been holding back, the actual physical act of forcing the man into cuffs. But as he looked at Vance's steady, waiting eyes, he felt a profound hesitation. There was a certainty in the man's posture that promised a world of trouble if he crossed that line. Vance saw the conflict in the officer's eyes. He had successfully de-escalated the physical threat without conceding his position. Now, it was time to end the confrontation. He had given the officer every chance to walk back from the ledge. The officer had refused. The time for subtle warnings was over. He slowly lowered his hands and spoke, his voice carrying the quiet finality of a judge reading a verdict. He had withheld the most critical piece of information, waiting for the precise moment when it would have the maximum undeniable impact. That moment was now. The street noise seemed to fade into a dull, distant roar, creating a bubble of intense focus around the two men. Officer Thorne was still breathing heavily, his mind racing, trying to find a way to reclaim the authority that had evaporated before his eyes. He had to do something. He had to reassert control. He opened his mouth, ready to issue another command, another threat. But Marcus Vance spoke first. "I am going to say this once, officer, so I advise you to listen carefully," Vance began, his voice calm, clear, and imbued with an authority that had nothing to do with volume. He reached inside his suit jacket with 2 fingers, a slow, deliberate movement designed to be seen as non-threatening. He did not pull out a wallet. He did not pull out a phone. He extracted a slim leather case. He held it up. "My name is Marcus Vance. I am a special agent with the United States Secret Service." He paused, letting the words settle. The effect was instantaneous and profound. It was as if a switch had been flipped, plunging the entire scene into a new, stark light. The title, Special Agent, carried an immense, almost mythical weight. Thorne's jaw, which had been tight with aggression, went slack. His eyes, which had been narrowed in anger, widened in disbelief. The sound that escaped his lips was not a word, but a small, choked gasp. Vance continued, his tone unchanging. "This vehicle," he said, gesturing with his head toward the gleaming black navigator, "is a federally registered government asset, assigned to me for a protective detail operating in this city. It is equipped with sensitive communications and countermeasures equipment." He let that sink in for another moment before delivering the final, devastating sentence. "By attempting to unlawfully seize this vehicle and by threatening to detain me, you are actively interfering with a federal agent in the performance of his duties. That, Officer Thorne, is a federal offense." Every word was a hammer blow, dismantling the flimsy structure of Thorne's assumptions. stolen car, drug dealer, thug in a suit. His entire narrative, the prejudice-fueled fantasy he had constructed, shattered into a million pieces. The reality was so much worse than he could have ever imagined. He hadn't just pulled over the wrong guy. He had, in his arrogant incompetence, blundered into a matter of national security. The crowd on the sidewalk, unable to hear the specifics of the conversation, could only see the dramatic shift in the officer's demeanor. They saw his bravado collapse like a punctured lung. They saw the color drain from his face. Sal, the tow operator, let out a low whistle. He now understood the man's impossible calm. It wasn't arrogance. It was the absolute certainty of someone who holds all the cards. Thorne stared at the credentials Vance now held open for him to see. The golden eagle, the official seal, the photograph that matched the face of the man standing before him. It was all real. The ground felt unsteady beneath his feet. The bright sunny day suddenly felt cold and menacing. He had made a mistake. Not just a simple mistake, but a career-ending, life-altering, cataclysmic mistake. The weight of that single, perfectly timed sentence pressed down on him, and in that moment, he felt like he was suffocating. The smirk that had been Officer Thorne's shield and sword throughout the encounter did not just fade, it shattered. It was a physical transformation, a collapse of facial muscles that had been held in a state of arrogant tension. His mouth fell slightly open. The aggressive light in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by a dawning, sickening panic. The world, which had seemed so simple and orderly just minutes before, had been turned upside down. The predator had become the prey. He looked from the impeccable credentials in Vance's hand to the agent's unblinking eyes. There was no triumph in Vance's expression, no hint of, "I told you so." There was only a quiet, professional gravity. This absence of emotion was somehow more terrifying than any gloating would have been. This wasn't personal for Agent Vance. It was procedural. And Thorne had just violated every procedure imaginable. His mind replayed the last 20 minutes in a horrifying high-speed montage. His condescending opening line, his baseless accusations, his refusal to run the plate, his public threats of arrest, his smug call for a tow truck, his physical lunge. Every single action, every word had been a step deeper into a professional grave he had dug for himself. His body camera had captured it all. The bystanders' phones had captured it all. He was the star of a training video on how to destroy a law enforcement career in under half an hour. "Officer," Vance's voice cut through his panicked thoughts. It was not a question. It was a prompt. It was his turn to act, and the options were dwindling rapidly. Thorne's training kicked in, but it was a clumsy, panicked response. He fumbled for his radio, his hand shaking so badly he almost dropped it. "Dispatch," he stammered, his voice a strained, reedy version of its former self. "Unit 714, situation has changed. Cancel the tow." The response from dispatch was immediate and tinged with confusion. 1040 Unit 714, tow is canceled. Is everything secure? Thorne couldn't answer. Secure? Nothing was secure. His career, his reputation, his future, all of it was dangling by a thread. He looked at Agent Vance, who was now slowly, deliberately placing his credentials back in his jacket. The agent's composure was an indictment in itself. Thorne started, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? "I'm sorry, I profiled you. I apologize, my prejudice got the better of me. I made a terrible mistake based on the color of your skin and the quality of your car." There were no words that could undo what had been done. The tow operator, Sal, needed no further instruction. He began quickly and efficiently retracting his chains and securing his equipment, eager to distance himself from the toxic fallout of the situation. He threw a last, pitying glance at Thorne before climbing back into his cab. As he drove away, the flashing yellow lights were extinguished, plunging the street back into the mundane light of a Tuesday afternoon. The departure of the truck felt like a final act, the end of the spectacle. All that was left was the quiet, horrifying aftermath. The bystanders began to disperse, their hushed conversations creating a buzz that Thorne could feel but not understand. They were no longer watching a show, they were leaving the scene of an accident. A slow, brutal, career-ending accident. Thorne was alone, standing in the middle of the street, facing a man he had tried to humiliate and arrest. A federal agent. His mind was a frantic scramble. He had to fix this. He had to do something. In the deafening silence left by the departing tow truck, Officer Thorne's mind grasped for a lifeline, a procedural escape hatch. There was only one option left that wasn't an outright admission of guilt and a plea for mercy. He needed someone else. He needed a witness from his side of the thin blue line, a superior officer who could take control of a situation that had spiraled so far beyond his abilities. It was a move born of pure desperation, a tacit admission that he had failed completely. His hand, still trembling, went back to his radio. He keyed the mic, his thumb slipping twice before he got a firm press. "Dispatch, Unit 714, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again, forcing a semblance of professionalism. "Requesting a supervisor at my location. Non-urgent." The qualifier, non-urgent, was a pathetic attempt to downplay the catastrophe. This was the most urgent situation of his 9-year career. Agent Vance stood by, his posture relaxed but his eyes watchful. He recognized the maneuver for what it was, a desperate attempt to shift responsibility. He made no objection. A supervisor was, in fact, the correct next step. The incident had moved beyond the street and would now become a matter for the official record, for reports and reviews. This was precisely the outcome he had anticipated and, in his own quiet way, engineered. He had given Thorne the rope, and the officer had eagerly fashioned his own noose. Now, a superior would be brought in to witness the hanging. The wait for the supervisor felt like an eternity. Thorne couldn't bring himself to look at Vance, so he stared at the pavement, at a crack in the asphalt, focusing on it as if it held the secrets to rewinding time. The remaining bystanders kept their distance, but they hadn't all left. They were waiting for the final act. Thorne could feel Vance's presence, a silent, towering monument to his own failure. He wished the agent would yell at him, curse him, anything to break the unbearable professional calm. An angry outburst would be human. It could be rationalized, dismissed. But this cold, quiet composure was something else entirely. It was the composure of a system, a vast and powerful federal apparatus that Thorne had just senselessly provoked. Finally, a marked patrol car, a sergeant's vehicle, turned the corner. It didn't speed, its approach measured and deliberate. It pulled up behind the navigator, and a man in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair and a face etched with the weariness of 1,000 similar calls stepped out. Sergeant Miller. Thorne knew him by reputation, a by-the-book, no-nonsense veteran who had seen everything. Thorne felt a fresh wave of dread. Miller was not the kind of supervisor who would help him sweep this under the rug. Sergeant Miller's eyes scanned the scene in a single, practiced sweep. Thorne, standing stiffly and looking pale, the man in the suit looking composed, the luxury vehicle parked legally at the curb, the last few onlookers trying to appear casual. "Thorne," Miller said, his voice even. "Talk to me. What's the call for?" Before Thorne could formulate a sanitized version of events, Agent Vance took a step forward. He had allowed Thorne to control the narrative until now, a narrative that had led to this very moment. Now it was time for the fact. "Sergeant," Vance said, his tone respectful but firm, "your officer was attempting to tow my vehicle without cause, and threatened me with arrest when I questioned his legal authority to do so." He held up his credentials. "Special Agent Marcus Vance, United States Secret Service." Sergeant Miller looked from the credentials to Thorne's ashen face. He blinked once, slowly. In that single, weary blink, Thorne saw his career flash before his eyes and then fade to black. Sergeant Miller's expression did not betray shock or anger. It was something far worse, a profound, weary resignation. He had seen young, arrogant officers fly too close to the sun before. He just hadn't expected the crash to be this spectacular. He took the credentials from Agent Vance, his movements deliberate. He didn't just glance at them, he studied them, turning the leather case over in his hands, feeling the weight of the federal seal. It was a small act of professional courtesy, a non-verbal signal that he, unlike his subordinate, understood and respected the authority they represented. "Agent Vance," Miller said, handing the credentials back, "I apologize for my officer's overzealousness." The word was a carefully chosen diplomatic understatement. "Are you or your vehicle currently under any restriction?" "No, Sergeant," Vance replied. "I was just about to leave when Officer Thorne initiated this encounter." Miller nodded, then turned his full attention to Thorne. His voice dropped, losing any hint of diplomacy. "Thorne, body cam, is it active?" "Yes, Sergeant," Thorne managed to say, his voice tight. "Has it been active for the entire duration of the interaction?" "Yes, Sergeant." Each word was a nail in his own coffin. Miller looked past Thorne at the empty space where the tow truck had been. "Dispatch logs show you called for a tow. On what grounds?" "The vehicle. It appeared suspicious," Thorne stammered, the excuse sounding pathetic and transparent now. "The driver was non-compliant with my instructions to step away from the car." Sergeant Miller's eyes, cold and analytical, bored into him. "Did you run the license plate before you called for the tow?" The question was a surgical strike, cutting straight to the heart of the procedural failure. Thorne hesitated. Lying was pointless. The dispatch logs would show no such query. "No, Sergeant. I was in the process of securing the scene." "Securing it from what?" Miller's voice was sharp. "A legally parked car? A man standing on a sidewalk?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned back to Vance. "Agent, my apologies again. You are, of course, free to go. Is there anything you require from us? A formal report number for your records?" "That would be helpful, Sergeant, thank you," Vance said. He gave a slight professional nod. He looked once more at Thorne, his expression unreadable, before turning, getting into the navigator and starting the engine. The powerful vehicle pulled away from the curb with a quiet hum, merging seamlessly into the city traffic and disappearing within seconds. It was as if it had never been there. The departure of Agent Vance left Thorne and Miller alone on the sidewalk, a small island of profound professional failure. The last of the onlookers, seeing the drama was over, finally drifted away. The street returned to its normal rhythm. Sergeant Miller let the silence stretch out, forcing Thorne to stew in the toxic cocktail of his own adrenaline and shame. He watched the traffic flow past, his jaw working silently. Thorne stood ramrod straight, staring ahead, waiting for the verdict he knew was coming. Finally, Miller spoke, his voice low and dangerously calm. "You know, Thorne, in 20 years I've seen a lot of mistakes, bad judgment, missed steps. But I have never, ever seen an officer so determined to destroy his own career over absolutely nothing. You didn't just make a mistake. You built a bonfire of protocol, drenched it in arrogance, and lit the match yourself." He took a step closer, his voice dropping further. "And you did it all on camera." With Agent Vance gone, the street seemed to reclaim its anonymity. The patch of asphalt where the confrontation had occurred held no memory of the tension, the threats, the quiet, seismic shift of power. But for Officer Thorne, the space was a crime scene, and he was both the perpetrator and the victim. Sergeant Miller didn't yell. He didn't lecture in the way a drill sergeant might. His method was colder, more clinical. He dismantled Thorne's actions piece by piece, not with anger, but with a quiet, relentless logic that offered no quarter. "Let's review," Miller said, his voice barely above a conversational tone. "You saw a black man in a nice car and your professional judgment was immediately compromised. You bypassed the most fundamental step of our job, verification. You didn't run the plate. You didn't ask for a license. You went straight to accusation and intimidation." Thorne remained silent. There was no defense. Miller's words were a perfect summary of the truth. "He questioned you," Miller continued, "politely and with a clear understanding of the law, and you interpreted that as a challenge to your authority. So you escalated. You called a tow truck for a legally parked vehicle. A tow truck, Thorne. What was the end game there? To teach him a lesson? To show the man you decided was a criminal that you were the boss? The questions were rhetorical. They were accusations phrased as inquiries, each one hitting its mark. Then, when he still refused to be intimidated, you threatened him with arrest. You, an officer of the law, threatened to take away a man's liberty because your ego was bruised. And not just any man, a federal agent, on assignment. Do you have any idea, any concept of the jurisdictional and political nightmare you just created? Thorne finally found his voice, a weak, desperate sound. I didn't know who he was, Sergeant. That's the whole point. Miller's voice finally rose, a sharp crack of frustration in his calm demeanor. You're not supposed to have to know who they are. The procedure is the same whether it's a janitor or a senator or a goddamn Secret Service agent. The rules are there to protect citizens from us, from bad judgment, from officers who think a hunch is the same as evidence. The rules you chose to ignore. He took a deep breath, reining his anger back in. He keyed his radio. Dispatch, show Unit 714 as 10-7 for the remainder of the shift. 10-7. Out of service. A wave of cold dread washed over Thorne. He was being pulled from the street, in the middle of his shift. It was a clear and public vote of no confidence. Sergeant, he started. Don't, Miller cut him off. Drive back to the precinct. Go to the locker room. Wait for me there. We are going to write the most detailed incident report of your life. And then you're going to talk to Internal Affairs. And then, most likely, you are going to be looking for a new job. The reversal was complete. Just 30 minutes earlier, Thorne had been the one issuing commands, dismissing concerns, wielding his power with impunity. Now, he was being ordered around like a rookie, his authority stripped away in a few quiet sentences. He was no longer Officer Thorne, enforcer of order. He was just Thorne, the subject of an internal investigation, a liability to the department. He gave a single, stiff nod. He couldn't trust himself to speak. He walked the loneliest 10 yards of his life to his patrol car, acutely aware of Sergeant Miller's eyes on his back, watching his every move. He got in, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb, leaving the scene of his career's demise behind him. The drive back to the precinct was surreal. The familiar streets looked alien. The routine calls crackling over the radio sounded like they were coming from a different world. Thorne drove on autopilot, his mind a maelstrom of regret and panic. Every traffic light, every intersection was a fresh reminder of the procedural world he had so recklessly abandoned. He saw other officers in their patrol cars, and he felt a profound sense of separation. He was no longer one of them. He was something other, something tainted. He parked in his assigned spot and cut the engine. For a long moment, he just sat there in the silence of the car, the steering wheel cool beneath his trembling hands. The precinct building, a place that had been a source of pride and identity, now loomed like a courthouse where he was about to be sentenced. He forced himself out of the car and walked toward the entrance. It was a walk of accountability, each step heavier than the last. He didn't make eye contact with the desk sergeant as he passed, just gave a curt nod and headed straight for the locker room. The familiar smells of disinfectant, stale coffee, and sweat did nothing to comfort him. The room was empty. He could hear the low hum of the ventilation system, a sound he had never noticed before. He sat on the bench in front of his locker, the metal cool through his uniform trousers. He didn't change, he just sat and waited. It was the same waiting he had tried to force upon Marcus Vance, but this time it was laden with dread, not power. 20 minutes later, Sergeant Miller walked in. He didn't speak. He just pointed toward the door that led to the administrative offices. Thorne stood and followed, his feet feeling like lead. They entered a small, windowless interview room, furnished with nothing but a metal table and 3 chairs. The walls were a sterile, institutional beige. The air was thick with the ghosts of 1,000 disciplinary interviews. Miller sat down and placed a small digital recorder on the table. He gestured for Thorne to take the opposite seat. This is the preliminary report, Miller stated, his voice all business. "Everything you say is on the record. It will be transcribed and given to the internal affairs investigator who will be handling your case. Do you understand?" Thorne nodded numbly. "Good," Miller said, pressing the record button. A small red light blinked to life. "For the record, state your name and badge number." "Officer Kevin Thorne, badge number 714. Sergeant Robert Miller, badge number 312, conducting." "Officer Thorne, please explain, in your own words, the events that led to the incident at Elm and 4th Street, beginning with your initial observation of the vehicle." And so, it began. Thorne recounted the story, but the words came out stripped of their earlier arrogance. His narrative of a suspicious vehicle and uncooperative subject sounded flimsy and weak in the sterile confines of the room. He tried to frame his actions as standard procedure, but under Miller's impassive gaze, the justifications crumbled. "So you saw the vehicle, and your immediate assessment was that it was potentially stolen," Miller interjected. "Based on the car and the location, yes, Sergeant. It was an anomaly." "Is an anomaly now the standard for probable cause, Thorne?" Miller asked, his voice laced with ice. "Did you observe any traffic violations? Any indication of criminal activity? Did you see the driver acting erratically?" "No, Sergeant. But my training and experience—" "Your training," Miller cut in, "tells you to verify, to run a plate, to ask for a license, to establish facts before you take action. Your experience seems to have taught you to take shortcuts based on prejudice. Is that an unfair assessment?" Thorne swallowed hard. "No, Sergeant." The admission hung in the air, a confession of the sin that underpinned the entire fiasco. It wasn't about a car. It was about the man standing next to it. It had always been about the man. Miller paused the recording. The red light went out. "The feds already called the chief's office," he said quietly. "The Secret Service doesn't take kindly to their agents being harassed by local cops on a power trip. This is out of our hands now, Thorne. You didn't just step on a landmine, you tap-danced on it." The rest of the interview was a blur of procedural questions and clipped one-word answers. Thorne felt like a component being disassembled. His actions laid out on the table for inspection, each one found to be faulty. When it was over, Sergeant Miller instructed him to write his full, detailed statement in a nearby office. As Thorne sat at a generic desk, staring at the blank incident report form, he learned the true speed of bureaucracy when it is sufficiently motivated. A lieutenant he barely knew entered the room and informed him that, per protocol involving altercations with federal agents, he was being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. "You'll need to surrender your firearm and your badge," the lieutenant said, his tone devoid of sympathy. "They'll be held pending the outcome of the IA investigation." The words hit Thorne like a physical blow. His gun and his badge were not just tools, they were the symbols of his identity, the very source of the authority he had so misused. To surrender them was to be stripped bare, reduced from an officer of the law to a civilian under investigation. He was escorted to the property clerk's office, where he unbuckled his duty belt and laid it on the counter. The heavy pistol, the handcuffs that had been inches from Vance's wrists, the radio he had used to call the tow, each item felt like a piece of his life being signed away. He unpinned his badge from his uniform, the polished metal feeling impossibly heavy in his palm. He pushed it across the counter. The clerk logged it without comment, his movements practiced and impersonal. Thorne was then told to go home and await contact from an internal affairs investigator. He was not to discuss the case with anyone. He was not to access any police databases. He was, for all intents and purposes, exiled. He walked out of the precinct through a back door, wearing his uniform but feeling like he was in a costume. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows that mirrored the one that had just fallen over his life. As he drove home, his personal car feeling strange and powerless after the authority of the patrol vehicle, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his partner. "Heard you had a rough one. What happened?" Thorne stared at the message, but he couldn't reply. He was ordered not to talk about it. He was isolated, adrift in a sea of his own making. Meanwhile, across town, the system he had provoked was moving with cold, silent efficiency. The digital file of his body camera footage was flagged and uploaded to a secure server. An IA detective was assigned the case, his first action to formally request Thorne's complete service record, including any prior complaints, no matter how minor. A formal request was also sent to the Secret Service for a copy of Agent Vance's official statement regarding the incident. The wheels of justice, or in this case, the wheels of accountability, were turning. Unlike the wheels of Thorne's patrol car, they were not guided by emotion or prejudice. They were guided by data, by video evidence, by recorded transmissions, and by the unblinking, unforgiving eye of procedure. Thorne had operated in a world of assumptions. He was now entering a world of facts, a world where his feelings and his gut instincts meant nothing. He was no longer a person, he was a case file. Case number IA-2026-0417, and the evidence against him was already overwhelming. The call from Internal Affairs came 2 days later. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. It was not a trial, they explained. There would be no jury. It was a departmental disciplinary hearing, a fact-finding board. Thorne's union representative, a tired, overworked man named Dave, advised him over the phone. Just stick to the facts, Kevin. Don't get emotional. Acknowledge the procedural missteps. Emphasize that there was no malicious intent. No malicious intent. The words felt like a lie. Thorne knew, in the honest, dark corners of his mind, that his intent from the very beginning had been malicious. He had intended to intimidate, to dominate, to put the man he had profiled in his place. He just hadn't intended for that man to be a federal agent. The day of the hearing arrived. Thorne wore his dress uniform, meticulously pressed, a desperate attempt to project the image of the dedicated officer he had once believed himself to be. The hearing room was small and impersonal, dominated by a long conference table. Seated on one side were 3 senior officers, a captain from Internal Affairs, a deputy chief, and a stern-faced woman from the department's legal counsel. Thorne and his union rep sat on the other. There were no pleasantries. The IA captain began by stating the case number and the allegations: dereliction of duty, violation of departmental procedure, and conduct unbecoming of an officer. Then, he gestured to a large monitor on the wall. We'll begin with a review of the body camera footage from the incident. Thorne's heart sank. He had to watch it all again, this time with his superiors dissecting his every failing. The video began. The sunny street, the gleaming navigator, his own arrogant voice cutting through the air. This is a nice car for this part of town. The deputy chief made a note on his legal pad. The video played on, his demand for papers, his baseless claim of a suspicious vehicle. Your vehicle doesn't fit the neighborhood. It's probable cause for me to believe it may be stolen. The department lawyer sighed audibly, a small sound of profound exasperation. They watched his call for the tow truck, his smug announcement that it would arrive in 15 minutes. They saw Vance's calm, repeated requests to verify the registration. They saw Thorne dismiss them out of hand. They saw him threaten arrest, his hand on his cuffs. They saw him lunge for Vance's arm. The captain paused the video. Right there, Officer Thorne. At this point, you have initiated physical contact without legal cause, is that correct? He was obstructing, Thorne began weakly. He was standing still, the lawyer corrected him, not even looking up from her notes. Please continue the video. The final damning minutes played out. Vance's revelation, the shattering of Thorne's composure, his panicked call to cancel the tow, the arrival of Sergeant Miller. The entire humiliating ordeal was laid bare on the screen. When the video ended, a heavy silence filled the room. Officer Thorne, the deputy chief said, his voice grave, this is one of the most egregious failures of basic police procedure I have ever witnessed. You had no cause for the stop. You had no cause for the tow. You had no cause for the threat of arrest. Every action you took escalated the situation, and every action was based not on fact or law, but on what appears to be a profound personal bias. The union rep cleared his throat. My client acknowledges his procedural errors. He was operating under the stress of a perceived threat. The lawyer cut him off. A perceived threat? The only threat in that entire video came from your client. Agent Vance was a model of professional decorum. He de-escalated at every turn. Officer Thorne did the opposite. The captain slid a folder across the table. The findings of this board are unanimous. The Secret Service has filed a formal complaint. The city's liability in this matter is significant, but more than that, your actions have brought discredit upon this entire department. He opened the folder. The recommendation is termination of employment effective immediately. The word hung in the air. Termination.
It wasn't a suspension.
It wasn't a demotion. It was the end. Thorne felt nothing. No shock, no anger, just a vast, empty numbness. He had known from the moment Vance had spoken that single, devastating sentence on the street that this was how it would end. He had just been waiting for the system to catch up. The process of separation was swift and clinical. Thorne was escorted from the hearing room to Human Resources, where he signed a series of documents acknowledging his termination. There was no final handshake, no good luck. He was a liability being excised from the body of the department. He walked back to the locker room for the last time, this time to collect his personal effects. The locker, which had held his life for 9 years, seemed small and insignificant. A spare pair of socks, a worn-out baseball cap, a photo of his parents. He packed it all into a cardboard box. As he walked out of the precinct, a civilian in street clothes carrying his life in a box, a group of new recruits was just entering, their faces bright with aspiration, their uniforms crisp and new. They didn't even notice him. He was already a ghost, a cautionary tale they would soon study in their ethics and procedure classes. The incident at Elm and 4th would become a case study, his name forever attached to a video that taught new officers everything not to do. His legacy would be his failure. His career was over, but the consequences rippled outward. The city's legal department began quiet negotiations with federal attorneys to stave off a potentially explosive lawsuit. A new mandatory departmental training module on bias and procedural justice was fast-tracked, with Thorne's body camera footage as its centerpiece. Sergeant Miller was quietly commended for his professional handling of the aftermath. And Marcus Vance? He never filed a lawsuit. He never spoke to the press.
His objective had not been revenge.
It had been accountability. The day after the incident, he was at his post, protecting a foreign dignitary, his focus absolute. The confrontation was documented in his report, a brief, factual addendum to his daily activities. The system had been challenged, and the system, in this rare instance, had corrected itself. For him, that was enough. He moved on, the silent, unwavering professional he had been all along. The contrast was absolute. One man's life continued, defined by his duty. The other's life was shattered, forever defined by his prejudice. The story of Kevin Thorne did not end with a dramatic court battle or a viral news cycle. It ended in the quiet anonymity of a terminated personnel file. But the questions it raises are neither quiet nor simple. The core of Thorne's failure wasn't a lack of training in use of force or criminal statutes. It was a profound failure of character. His need for control, likely born from a deep-seated insecurity, manifested as a rigid worldview where anything that didn't fit his narrow definition of normal was an immediate threat. The sight of a successful black man became a personal affront to this worldview, a challenge not to the law, but to his own fragile sense of order. His prejudice wasn't just an ugly opinion, it was an operational tool he used to simplify the world into us and them, a shortcut that allowed him to bypass the hard work of critical thinking and verification. Could this have gone differently? What if Agent Vance had not been a federal agent but a doctor, a lawyer, or a software engineer who happened to be black and successful? Without the shield of the Secret Service, his composure might have been broken. His calm, legalistic questions could have been twisted into a narrative of a sovereign citizen or an agitated subject, leading to a wrongful arrest and a brutal, life-altering struggle to clear his name. What if Vance had reacted with anger, his voice raised in righteous indignation? That anger, however justified, would have likely been used by Thorne as the final piece of evidence he needed to justify physical force, with potentially tragic consequences. Vance's survival strategy was one of radical composure, a strategy that black men in America are too often forced to master. To be so impeccably calm, so procedurally perfect, that bias has no hook to hang its hat on. The burden of de-escalation should never have been his. It should have been the officer's. This story is a stark reminder that authority without accountability is merely tyranny in a uniform. The system held this time, not because of its inherent goodness, but because one man's training and composure intersected with another man's flagrant and fully documented incompetence. Documentation was the key. The body camera, the bystander's phone, the dispatch log. They formed an undeniable record that left no room for the lies and rationalizations that so often cloud these encounters. It teaches us that the fight against injustice is not always won with a shout, but sometimes with the quiet, persistent demand for facts, for verification, for the simple, boring, and beautiful power of procedure. What would you have done in Agent Vance's position? At what point in the encounter did you feel the officer crossed a line from which there was no return? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if these stories matter to you, please consider subscribing. The next breakdown is one you won't want to miss.